The theme of our breakfast is an important one. Back in 2013, the Department of Sport and Recreation undertook a community coaches and officials survey. Now, the idea was to better understand the needs of community coaches and officials and to understand those areas that impact on coaches and official development throughout the sport and rec industry. Through this survey, there were a number of recommendations. They were made over 2 separate reports focusing on coaches and officials. And a key recommendation, indeed the highest priority that came from both reports, highlighted the need to better engage young people in roles such as coaching and officiating. Now, this has led DSR to develop today's breakfast theme around youth engagement and the next generation. We hope that this will assist you in this critical area as you have identified this through industry consultation. I would remind you, of course, after our keynote speaker, we'd love to hear from you, so think about some questions if any pop to mind. But in the meantime, our guest speaker is a very special one. Mark McCrindle is an award-winning social researcher, best-selling author and influential thought leader who has delivered strategic advice to many high-profile sport and recreation organisations across the nation, including Surf Lifesaving Queensland, Royal Lifesaving Australia, Australian Sports Commission, the Australian Institute of Sport and the Queensland Department of National Parks, Rec, Sport and Racing. Mark understands key social trends and engaged communication style places him in high demand in the press. He's appeared on programs such as Sunrise and A Current Affair, and he counts among his clients more than 100 of Australia's largest companies. Hopefully we get a big chance to learn a bit more about how to engage in our youth. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker this morning, Mr. Mark McCrindle. Round of applause, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Clint, and good morning. Well, it's great to have this chance to talk to you about this emerging generation, about these changing times, about WA, the demographic shifts and the social shifts and the generational shifts that are really defining the context for this emerging generation of young people that you are leading and influencing and connecting with. You know, I was thinking about our era. If we summed up these times in which the emerging generation are coming of age, if we were to sum up this era with a single word, it would probably be this word change, because that's what defines the context in which they're coming of age. Now, every generation has been shaped in times of great change. Every era has had to deal with change, of course, but probably what's unique to this particular era in which Generation Z, today's children, are coming of age is not just that there's change, but it's the speed of the change. It's the extent of it. It's the scope of the change that's just transforming every area of life. Recently I was writing a summary of this change, and I began with this sentence that it's only occasionally in history that you get massive technological change, and that combined with rapid demographic shifts and huge social change and ongoing generational transitions. And you know, the confluence of these trends is such that within the span of a decade or two, society altogether alters. And we're living in the midst of one such transformative decade right at the moment. Now, here we are, almost halfway through this decade that began in 2010 with tablet computing and apps and social media coming of age. It's going to take us through to that iconic year of 2020 that's always been that futuristic year. We're halfway through the decade now. It's brought about great change. We can only imagine what times will be like by the time the decade wraps up and we hit 2020. So times of massive change. And I thought in the brief time that we have, we could use even this sentence as a bit of guidance to navigate through the times that are transforming Generation Y and Generation Z and even the next ones coming after them as well. So probably the first front of mind issue when we think about Generation Z and today's young people that is transforming them, that is iconic for them, would have to be the technology and how influential that is in their world. We know that we're living in times of change technologically, not only because we've got new devices in our pockets or on our desks, you know, how we shop, how we buy, communicate, connect, it's all being transformed through these technologies. Not only that, technology changes our language. It gives us new words, it transforms words. I was looking up a couple of dictionary sites just to look at words of the year to see what new words have entered our lexicon in the last 5 years. And if you go back 5 years, the word of the year in 2009 was the word tweet. Tells us something about the new platforms that are emerging. There have been a lot of tweets for a long time, but they used to come from birds. But now the tweets that matter are those tweets on Twitter. There are 500 million of them every single day on that platform, all in 140 characters. So that tells us something about the short form of communication, how people are expecting that communication in shorter ways. The word of the year of 2010 was the word app. So that tells us how we get our information, how we're influenced. We carry these devices. It's an app-based world. More than 1 million apps available on the App Store. Carry these technological smartphones that have all of these apps in just one button. It's a pretty phenomenal world. We didn't have apps prior to 2010 because we didn't have tablets prior to 2010, except for there were tablets, but they were medications that we took with meals. But now, when we say tablets, we're talking about what our kids are interacting with and on. From the youngest age, they start their computer world on computers that don't have keyboards, that are touch screen, that are intuitive, that are visual, that are glass-based. This is the world of Generation Z, and it's an immediate, short-term, empowered technology that drives their environment. The word of the year of 2011 was the word cloud, which tells us something about this era as well, where we are wireless, where we telework, where we move around and access data in the clouds. Clouds have been around for a while, but the cloud that matters is where's our stuff stored and can I access it? Is it safe? And it's a cloud-based world. The word of 2012 wasn't even a word. That's how strange these times are. Hashtag was the word of 2012. And we've got a whole generation that don't go to mainstream news sites to get their news. They just look at what are the trending hashtags on their social media feed. That tells them what the current issues of the day are. So transform through technology. The word of the year last year was the word selfie. Tells us again something about our era and how we communicate. But I put this photo up because, like most selfies, it was a bit of a groupie more than a selfie. And it was taken earlier this year on the red carpet of the Oscars. And you can see that the numbers here, it's been the most retweeted selfie of all time. 3.4 million retweets just within the first couple of hours. So it tells us something about the viral nature of technology and connectivity these days for this generation. And of course, the global nature. We sometimes forget how quickly technology has transformed our era. We've seen technology move through different formats and platforms, but the youngest generation of today have only ever known this world. It was just a decade ago that Facebook was still being pieced together in Mark Zuckerberg's dorm room back at Harvard University. And yet today, if social media sites were countries, just based on the popularity of them, then Facebook would be the largest country on the planet. More people active on Facebook than even people in the large nation of China. If social media sites were countries, then Twitter would be the fourth largest country on the planet, more people on Twitter than even people in the US. Even new platforms like Instagram would round out the top 10 countries of the world based on popularity, based on membership, based on activity, if social media sites were countries. So a big transformation in a short period of time. We knew the 20th century and had structured thinking that was shaped in that era. This generation have only ever known this world of connectivity. I mean, think of the social platforms, think of the communication platforms and apps that they have that drive their world. They're empowered. They're a few clicks away from any piece of information on the planet or potentially from almost any person on the planet. Their networks are large and global and influential. When we were coming of age, though, we didn't have a social network developed like this. In fact, I was thinking what limited our social network, what defined the social connectivity of our era when we were their age, coming of age, and probably it was that device. That's as technological as it got. And the old teledex stored the full extent of our social world. Now, if you're very lucky, your dad would let you pencil your friends' names beside your parents' friends' names. That's just how it worked. But what a transformation we've seen in a decade. The teledex was so important. It sat with pride of place beside the phone, on the phone table. You needed a table for your phones back in the day, didn't you? What a big change we have seen in a short period of time. So technology is transforming things, but for this generation, the demography is being transformed as well. They're coming of age in a very different Australia, in a growing Australia, in a changing Australia, and a changing WA as well. Part of the challenge that we have with sport and recreation and engagement in WA particularly is that we are a big country geographically. I mean, I've taken some other countries, just laid them across the landmass of Australia. It's a big nation, 7.7 million square kilometres, and a third of the total national landscape, a third of this continent nation is comprised of WA, 2.5 million square kilometres. So from a population density perspective, that gives you amongst the lowest population densities on the planet. And yet, if you look at the city of Perth here, you've got in some parts of Perth amongst the highest population densities that you find in any developed city right around the world. This is the challenge that we face, the big landmass and the big geography. But we're also a big country demographically these days. We're approaching 24 million people. And in fact, if I was to sum up the demographics of WA at the moment and Australia as a whole using 3 words, firstly I would say it's growing. The nation and, of course, the state. You know, we're adding almost an extra 1 million people to our nation every 2 years. That's some pretty significant growth. In fact, numerically, it's never been greater. And if you put it in percentage terms, it's 1.7% per annum, which doesn't sound much, but it actually means we're the fastest growing nation in the developed world right at the moment. And the fastest growing state in the fastest growing nation in the developed world, of course, is right here, WA, growing at almost twice. In fact, a couple of years ago, it was right on twice the national population growth rate, pretty significant. All the states and territories are growing from a natural increase perspective. There are more births than deaths in every state and territory. Every state has more people arriving to that state from overseas than is departing to go overseas. But only 3 states have a third factor of growth, which is net interstate migration. That is more people arriving into the state than are going to other states. And of course, none greater than right here in WA, of course. So you're leading the charge from the growth perspective, a growing state in, of course, a fast-growing nation. Now, putting your growth into perspective, in the last 12 months, WA has grown by 82,000 people. Over that same period of time, Tasmania has grown by around 1,000 people. So putting that into perspective, WA is growing by more people every 5 days than Tassie adds in a whole year. Now, we won't get into a GST allocation debate. We'll leave that one for the... We won't discuss senators and how many senators you should have based on your population. We'll leave that for another day. But just let it be said that, of course, you're punching above your weight demographically. The growth here is phenomenal. You're a growing state in a growing nation. In fact, you're hitting many of the figures at the moment for the Australian Bureau of Statistics A-series highball forecast for population growth, which tells us that in about a decade we will have in WA 3.5 million people and 3 million people right here in Perth. That is the growth that you're experiencing, and there is, of course, a challenge meeting those growth numbers in that regard. But where else would people want to be living? In fact, we were surveying Australians recently, asking them what they love about Australia and what they love about their particular area. And I thought I had to put up a comment that came from Peter, a Gen Xer, and he said, waking up each day knowing I don't live in Melbourne lifts my mood on a daily basis. So I'm sure we can all agree with that one. Which brings me to the second of these factors defining the growth and shaping this next generation as they come of age here in WA, and that is that it's a changing state. Changing in terms of the culture of diversity. It's a generation that is the most culturally diverse. If we take our total population, 1 in 4 of us was born overseas. Now that figure, the 1 in 4 born overseas, has actually remained constant for about 60 years now. We've always been culturally diverse, although the numbers are slightly higher. So 27% of Australians was born overseas. But if we look here in WA, it's actually closer to, well, it's just over 1/3 of the total population was born overseas. In fact, if you look nationally at all households that have cultural diversity represented, it's significantly more than that. If you take our 9 million households and look at how many of them have one or both parents born overseas, because to understand cultural diversity, don't worry about country of birth of individual, have a look at country of birth of parent, because if mum or dad was born overseas, that's going to shape cultural identity, that's going to shape language spoken at home, that's going to shape priority of sport or otherwise, that's going to shape a lot of values and perspectives. And so if we look at all households in Australia that have one or both parents born overseas, we're at 46% of all households. I gave you this population infographic here, Australia Street. We said, look, let's say the population of 9 million households was shrunk down to be a street of 100 homes, 100 households. What would it look like? And 47 of those homes on the street would have one or both parents born overseas. But here in WA, it's actually closer to 2/3 of all households have one or both parents born overseas. Far more cultural diversity here than in any other state or territory when represented by country of birth of individual and of parents. And so the other way that it's changing here in Perth is a growth in the population density. If we look at our cities. Perth has now joined this illustrious club of 4 cities nationally that is part of the 2 million club. Sydney got there in 1959 and Melbourne got there in 1975. Brisbane, just a few years ago, got to 2 million, and it was just this year that Perth hit the 2 million mark. So growing and changing, and the increase in the density. The interesting thing, if you look at the demographics of our states and territories, is that Perth leads the charge with having as being the city, the capital city that has the highest proportion of its state's population. So if we look at Brisbane, less than half of the Queensland population lives in the capital of Brisbane. By the time you get to New South Wales, just under 2/3 of the state's population lives in its capital. By the time you get to Melbourne, 3/4 of the Victorian population lives in the capital of Melbourne. But here in Perth, out in front of everyone else, you've got 77% of Western Australia's population living right here in the capital of Perth. So low population density across the state, massive population density, particularly in some parts of Perth, a growing and a changing demographic. I thought I'd just test you on one thing. We found when we ran this survey and looked at the data that what else is changing is our use of language. More than half of the population still uses the phrase "no worries." It's the most widely used Australian phrase. And "g'day" and "arvo" are the most commonly used contracted words. More than half of the population use it. But we found that less than half of Generation Y use traditional Aussie rhyming slang terms. Now, I thought I'd see how you go connecting with some of the old school language. So if you're out there going for a walk and you see a Joe Blake, then you have seen. Very good. So you're beyond more than half of the Gen Ys who didn't know that. What about if you have a Captain Cook? You have a look. Very good. What about if you hit the Frog and Toad? There you go. You're up with it. Good. What about if you do the Harold Holt? Very good. You do the Bolt. Excellent. And occasionally it happens that you have an absolute Barry Crocker, in which case... All right, well done. So you are up with the Aussie language. This is encouraging. Yeah, the third thing I'd say about the demographics, the shaping WA for Generation Z. It's growing and it's changing, but of course it's aging. So they're coming of age in a nation and a state where the population is actually aging. If we go back 3 decades when many of us were coming of age, the population profile looked like that. You had more young people and fewer older people. So the young people dominated things. So we had a society that was focused on youth centres and youth programs and young people engaging with them because they actually comprised the bulk of the population, and they therefore got the bulk of government funding based on a sort of per head of population perspective. By the time we move 3 decades on to today, you start to see the population profile changing. We don't so much call it the population pyramid anymore because it's losing that pyramid shape. And in 3 decades' time, you see that the shape has definitely changed, far more rectangular. In fact, by 2044, we will have more people aged over 60 than aged under 18 for the first time in our history, a slightly inverted population pyramid. And so we've got a generation that are coming of age with a time, an era of increasing age. The challenge that we have these days in sport or community engagement is that there's a wider age range that you're connecting with than we've ever seen before. You've got volunteers that are coming in. People are active later. People are younger, longer, and so connecting across more generations than ever before. So to understand the emerging generations matters more than ever because the age gaps that we're bridging has never been greater. Now, the population profile is well represented by looking at the median age, the average age, the midpoint in the population. And Perth has a younger median age than, well, WA is the same, but than Australia as a whole. If we go back 3 decades and look at the midpoint in our population nationally, it had only just tipped out of the 20s. It was 30 years of age. Today, as you can see, it takes us to the mid to late 30s. In 3 decades' time, the average age of an Australian will be 40 years of age. So that gives us a sense of the ageing profile in which we currently find ourselves. But it's a good news story. You know, this ageing of the population is an excellent thing because it just simply means we're living longer. We're younger, longer, we're active later in life. We've added, in the last generation, about 10 years of life expectancy. A young child born in 1984 could expect to live at birth into their mid-70s. Today, life expectancy at birth takes us to the early 80s, and in 3 decades' time, life expectancy at birth will take us to 90 years of age. Now, of course, as you move through those different milestones, that longevity forecast increase. But what it means is we've added about 10 years of life expectancy to our our era in the last generation. Now, this is years of life. It doesn't represent quality of those years. And this is the key challenge for us in sport and recreation, to encourage participation with this generation, who are the most sedentary compared to previous generations, who have the most screen time, who are bombarded with entertainment options that involve them sitting rather than remaining active. The reason that longevity forecasts increase is not because we've got a healthier society, we're more active, we're eating better, we're eating less junk food. It's because the medical profession can ensure we do live longer and can provide solutions to many problems that in the past were morbid. And I guess the challenge that we have is, how can we add to the length of years, quality of those years, by encouraging participation by young people and activity in sport. So the old statement turns out to be demographically correct, that 60 is the new 50. You might have heard that. It's true, we're down aging. 50 is the new 40. We've added 10 years of life. 40 is the new 30, you might have heard, or 30 is the new 20, although I haven't heard anyone say 20 is the new 10. So, at some point, that whole metaphor breaks down. But you get the point that we're adding extra years, and this is encouraging, but it means that we've got to encourage quality of those years by encouraging participation. It also means that we are bridging more of those gaps. So let's make sure we work harder as we all age, and the young people are forever, that same age. Let's make sure we work hard on finding out how to bridge those gaps, which means some of the old approaches of management and leading and communicating and guiding teams won't work these days. I saw this old sign in a workplace, warning to all personnel: firings will continue until morale improves. Not sure that that's going to work. It probably never did work, but it's an era where we have to work harder on the motivation and the engagement. So demographically, technologically, culturally, great change. Next here, socially, we are changing. The life stages have changed. If we go back to the 20th century, it was pretty simple. There was childhood, there was teenagerhood, there was adulthood. It's far more complex, more nuanced than that these days for the younger generation coming of age. Firstly, they are older, younger. Or if there's down aging at the older age, there's up aging at the younger age. There's the emergence of the tweens. And you might have noticed, in dealing with the younger ones, that the tweens, the 8 to 12-year-olds, are sort of like yesterday's teens, by way of their access to information, their awareness, their sophistication, their use of technology. They are older than their years would suggest. In fact, some people are saying that the tweens aren't the 8 to 12s anymore, they're the 7 to 11s or the 6 to 10s. It just keeps up aging, such as the access to information that they have. And so, in a sense, these days, adolescence begins early. We know that physical maturity is onsetting earlier. And so we've got children that are bigger and more mature at a younger age. In a sense, we're starting to decouple the chronological age from that psychological age. So adolescence, in a sense, is beginning earlier, but it's extending later. It's lasting longer, in that we've got young people delaying the traditional markers of adulthood. The marriage and mortgage and children and career and first home, it's being pushed back. And so the emergence of the young adult life stage. You might have seen this, that people are in education longer, they're delaying careers, they're staying at home with their parents later in life. I think by the time the mid-20s become late 20s, it's probably a stretch to still call them young adults, but I think the term kippers sums up the reality pretty well. K-I-P-P-E-R-S, that stands for kids in parents' pockets eroding retirement savings. So just thought I'd point that out in case you've got some kippers in your household. But of course, what this means is that there are greater opportunities to engage this generation of young adults into officiating and coaching and volunteering roles, because they're starting their own families later. They've got, in a sense, an extra decade of life experience, of freedom, of transience across roles and jobs, of education, and the opportunity to get involved. So socially, the life stages are being transformed. Socially, where we live and how we live is changing as well. We've got a generation that are renting longer in life, later in life, that are renting for lifestyle reasons, not just housing affordability reasons, that may not be able to afford where they want to live, so they'll rent there. They're happy to rent. They like the freedom of that, an increase in the rental numbers. While across Perth, 3 in 4 householders still live in a detached home, 1 in 4 live in an apartment or a unit. If you look at new housing approvals, it's closing in on the 50-50 mark. And we'll probably get to that point in the next decade where half of all new homes are vertical communities, not just the traditional horizontal communities of the past, which is going to, again, compel us to ensure we get that activity and where people won't have backyards, where when it comes to playing sport and getting involved in recreation, it is going to have to be out of the home, and encouraging them to participate in community-based activities is going to be important. But the other challenge we have with an increase in the number of renters and people renting more is that renters stay on average just 1.8 years per home across Australia. I mean, even those that buy a home aren't staying 20 or 30 or 40 years in that home like our parents did. You know, buy the home, start the family there, raise the kids there, still living there as empty nesters decades later. The average Australian couple or household who buys a home stays just 8 years in that home. They buy maybe the apartment, kids come along, they upgrade to a townhouse, kids are growing up, they move somewhere else, moving across more homes, which means moving across more communities, which means that increasingly we're connecting with people who might have started at the club when they were, you know, in the under sixes, but in that time they've now moved, and the next siblings are coming along, or the kids are still moving through. Now they're travelling further because they've moved homes every 2 years or every 8 years, far more churn. People are living in the community who don't know that community. As you saw from the data, the majority of the state were born elsewhere, either in another country or another state or another part of the state. So far more fluidity and change and mobility than we've ever seen before. Those that have paid off their home, mainly in the older generation, have obviously stayed longer in that home. But not only are we moving homes more frequently, people are moving jobs more frequently. The median tenure of an Australian in their job today is now 3 years. So this generation will move across more jobs than ever. In fact, if that plays out in the lifetime of these Gen Z school leavers, then that means that they will have 17 separate employers in their lifetime, based on the retirement trends where they'll work later in life. And they'll upskill every 3 or so jobs, so they'll have 5 separate careers. They'll live across 15 different homes based on those metrics that I shared. And so the change, the churn is phenomenal these days. This mobility that we see, this change, this accelerated life cycle socially, we also see through technology. If you have a look at memes, global memes, these are these online trends, that sort of fads that go around the internet. The very first online global meme happened just a few years ago. It was in 2010. It was photobombing. You remember that? Probably remember the term that was coined, and it was all began by this squirrel. You know, back before the selfie, when you'd set up the camera on the rock with the timer, couple set up the photo, squirrel jumped in the way. They said, hey, our photo's been bombed. They coined this term, they put it online. People thought it was a pretty cool concept, so other people started going through their holiday photos, looking for things that they had never noticed before. And they thought that's pretty cool, and so they put that photo up, and within weeks there were thousands of these photobomb photos, millions of views. That was the speed of it. But the life cycle of the photobombing meme lasted some months before it dropped away. By the time we got to 2011, the meme of the year was planking. You might remember that one. Seems like a lifetime ago. It was only 3 years ago. But the acceleration of the planking meme was not months, but indeed weeks. I was trying to work out how people even came up with that idea, you know, lie like a plank and get a photo taken. My current theory is that it was an accident. It was something that happened, and people thought, that's a really cool idea, I'm going to try that out. So the whole thing went global. By the time we got to 2012, you might remember the meme of the year, Gangnam Style. And we groan when we hear it because we're like, oh, you know, because that's the thing. It lasted just sort of weeks and then it died away. But in those weeks, in fact, probably overall, you would say months, it got more than 2 billion views, which means that almost 1 in 3 people on the face of the planet have watched this YouTube video by this South Korean pop star with his Gangnam Style video. That's the connectivity, that's the viral connection and the speed of the take-up of these memes. By the time we got to last year, 2013, the meme of the year was Harlem Shake, hundreds of millions of views, lots of people doing it in their own way. But if you haven't seen the Harlem Shake, don't worry about it. First, it's not very good, and secondly, it's very 2013. We've all moved on, so don't worry about it. In fact, we haven't even finished 2014, but I reckon we could probably have a guess. What do you think has been the meme of the year when you think about online this year? What's gone viral? I heard someone mention Ice Bucket Challenge. I agree with you. That's probably the meme of the year. So the acceleration of these memes, of course, is phenomenal. So technologically, socially, demographically, we are being transformed in a shorter period of time than ever, and that is the context in which this generation are coming of age. And they're coming of age as the baton is being passed from one generation to the next. You know, part of the challenge is how can we engage with this generation as new generations are moving through the profiles. You know, we've got the generations defined here. You can see each of the generations based on the year of birth and based on their numbers in our society. And so we've got transitioning of the generations. The baby boomers generation, our largest generation, are passing the baton on as leaders to Gen Xers who are moving into leadership roles in organisations, in our community groups and in sporting clubs. The Gen Xers have been the parents for the last decade or two, and they're passing that baton on to Generation Y, who are moving in as the new parents. Gen Ys are now in their early 30s, and that's the peak age of starting families in Australia today. And Generation Y, who've been entering the workforce during the last decade, are passing that workforce baton on to Generation Z, who are now entering the workforce in record numbers, and will be 1 in 6 workers by the end of this decade. So massive generational transitions taking place. In fact, let's just see the mix of the generations that we have here in the room. So firstly, baby boomers, born 1946 to 1964. Hands up, baby boomers with us. So lots of you still influencing, changing, volunteering, making a difference. Fantastic to see baby boomers. You know, the baby boomers are a quarter of the population, but they own more than half of the national private wealth, the highest net worth generation. So I hope we took note of those hands if we're needing a loan, particularly us Gen Xers. Debt and dependence sort of sums up our particular life stage, so hopefully we saw those baby boomer hands. In fact, the Gen Xers, 1965 to 1979, hands up, Gen Xers come after Gen baby boomers. Fantastic, good numbers of us Gen Xers. Good to see we're around. I sometimes feel we're a bit overlooked. We've had 50 years of baby boomers, and now it's all Gen Y, and we sort of got mixed and overlooked in the middle. We're a little bit like Prince Charles in some ways. We know what's going to happen. That crown is going to go right over our head, and Prince William's going to take it away. That's just how it works. So let's think about Gen Y, born from 1980. Hands up the Gen Ys with us. So that's pretty good numbers. Not quite the 1 in 4 that we have in the workforce, but it's still fairly early on a Friday morning. I'm going to give them a break. Perhaps as we're wrapping things up in a little bit of time, we'll have a few more join us, but that's just, they teach us a lot about work-life balance. I think that's good. And of course, Gen Z are those we're connecting with, but increasingly it's going to be Generation Alpha. Now, we're dealing with a more formally educated generation. For us, Gen X is about 1 in 4 has a degree. For Gen Y, it's about 1 in 3, but for Generation Z, born since the mid-90s, children and teenagers of today, about half of them will end up with a university degree in their lifetime, more formally educated. They're not responding to traditional hierarchical structures. So when it comes to leading them, influencing them, getting them on board as volunteers, while we were shaped in this hierarchical structure, you know, the authoritarian model and clear positional structures around it, this generation have been empowered. They create the content, they're collaborators, they're contributors, they're participators, they're not just sort of sit and listen generation, and so they're used to a flat structure. Leadership across an organisation, self-directed in their approach. That's the style that works for them. Now, it's not to say we don't need leadership and guidance. We do, but we need it in a way where there's a bit more participation. I found that there's another meme doing the rounds at the moment called "You Only Had One Job" meme, and highlights what happens when you don't have good leadership and supervision. You get your tiles all messed up, and that's not a great thing. And I found that without good leadership on the production line, you end up with the wrong items in the wrong packages, and that's pretty annoying. And as for what went wrong with the painting department that were putting safety messages on roads, I'm not sure, but something dramatically happened. I guess the challenge we have with Generation Z is that they even speak a different dialect of English, such as the texting language of today. In fact, a Gen Z sentence came my way recently, and I was trying to decipher it. Here was the sentence: "For shiz, my work gig is totes cron. The hours are def's cron, but the hours are def's cray cray, but YOLO." And it took me about an hour on UrbanDictionary.com to sort of work that one out. But does anyone know what for shiz means? For sure, very good. And what totes is short for totally, and defs is short for definitely. Cray cray means crazy. YOLO means you only live once. Yeah, fantastic. So you're up with it. This is encouraging. It took me about an hour to work out, but I think what they were trying to say, and fairly long sentence, but I think what they were trying to say is, I like my job. So that's the generation. I guess let me summarise all of this by saying, you know, a simple thing and leaving you with 4 final words to consider. That it's only occasionally that you get the massive generational change that we're seeing right now. And we've had a saying in our research for some time that we're all just a generation away from irrelevance. You know, we might have been able to connect with Gen Ys, but unless we can connect with the Gen Zs or the Gen Alphas or whoever's coming after that, we're going to be on the margins of relevance. But I think the speed of change is such today that we're not just a generation away, we're perhaps a decade away, maybe just a few years away. We've got to keep updated with how to communicate and connect these days. So let me summarise with 4 takeaway words which might be able to be put into practice from a leading, influencing, officiating and communicating perspective. Firstly, we've got to keep it real. We've got to keep it authentic and genuine. A couple of weeks ago in Sydney, it was Safety at Work Week, and I saw an employer was pretty diligent to get a safety message out there to his staff, but unfortunately his execution didn't quite marry the walk did not match the talk, and that's not great. So we're going to keep it real and authentic. We've got to keep it relevant, which means adjust, adapt, and make sure how we communicate makes sense these days. In the US, they've had a safety message at waterways for a while, and it used to be relevant, but no longer is. If you see someone drowning, the sign would say, and that's supposed to be a picture, help, help, you know, I'm drowning, a stick figure there, but that's not how we read it. If you see someone drowning, LOL. Now, to lol, that's not the right response when someone is out there in the water. So it needs updating. So keep it real, keep it relevant, keep it responsive, which means adjust, adapt, respond to the changes that you see out there. You know, ever since the GFC, there's been a change in the workplace. A lot more Australians are bringing their lunch to work, and that's fine, but those lunch fridges are getting more and more full. You know, people bring a loaf of bread or a tub of margarine, and other people have been borrowing, you know, other people's lunch, a bit of cheese here, a bit of bread there. And so this guy has invented this anti-theft lunch bag, which I thought was a pretty cool idea. He gets these Ziploc bags, he screen prints black paint on the outside of them. So you put your lunch in and you put it in the fridge. It's pretty cool. I mean, that's not safe, but I mean, that one, no one's going to mess with your lunch when it's in the anti-theft lunch bag. And finally, of course, in addition to keeping it real and relevant and responsive, keep it relational. Always has been and will be the key to teamwork, the key to sport, the foundation of coaching and connecting that relational network. It matters even more in a social media driven world. We just expect that relational foundation, although I think this one took it a bit too far. Be the first of your friends to like this post. I think that was taken a bit too literally, but nonetheless, you get the point. If we can keep it real and relevant and responsive and relational, I think we'll connect with each generation, and their future and yours will be bright. So I wish you all the best in connecting today and into the future, and thanks for listening.